Hey everybody, it's Ryan again. This video is due to popular demand. I've been asked about this quite a bit lately, and it's pretty much how do I start my workflow? How do I process my raw files? How do I focus blend? How do I exposure blend? So this is what's going to be covered in this video. I've got a handful of raw files pulled out here, and I'll show you just about how I go about prepping files and then piecing those puzzles or piecing together the puzzle. And that's kind of the analogy I use for it. Is it seems for me like you've got all these pieces of your different raw files. You've got one exposed for the sky, one exposed for the land areas, or you've got different focus points that you've shot, and they're all puzzle pieces. And you've got to pick out the different puzzle pieces that you need to kind of piece that puzzle together to get your good kind of base image where everything's got good dynamic range, good depth of field. So that's what we're covering here. So we'll just jump right into it here. These first files we'll work on. Let's open these. Okay, so here's what we've got. Fairly standard mountain wildflower shot. You guys may have seen this on my site before. This image. So what this is a little bit of a focus blend and a little bit of an exposure blend. Nothing too hardcore at the moment. So as we look through these, you can see, as I scroll through the different files, I've changed focus points and I've changed exposure slightly. This very first file right here at the top, this is focused for this foreground, the immediate foreground right here. I do all this in live view. This was back on my old Canon 5D Mark II. I've since switched over to the Sony A7R, but the concept is all the same. Using live view for me just works better all around. I normally don't ever use my viewfinder. One reason is because I wear glasses and it's hard to look through a viewfinder when you're wearing glasses. Another reason is I like to be able to zoom in live view and precisely set focus. So when I'm shooting, I've got my camera on the tripod, I've got my composition all dialed in. I find the proper exposure that I want. This case, it was really kind of a darker exposure. And so once I've got that all dialed in, I am able to go into live view, zoom in live view, and set the focus exactly where I want it. So in this file, it was focused around here in the immediate foreground. I take my exposure and then open up live view again, change to a different focus point. So this one was focused for a little bit further back, more about in these flower areas here. I take this exposure, then I open live view back up again, zoom in live view again, and set my focus point for a little bit further back. So it's going to be more kind of back in this area, a little bit further back. Take that exposure, open up live view again, take another exposure, focused even further back, and this was focused more back for this the midground and background areas. Take that exposure, and then this exposure has the same focus point as the previous one. So I didn't change focus points, I just changed to a shorter shutter speed. As to not clip out my highlights in my sky. So that's kind of my approach to it is, I start with a focus point exposed for, kind of whatever I'm going for at the time. This file is a little bit different because I was in such a hurry while I was shooting this. The light was fading really quick. It was the only light that had really shown up the entire evening, and it lasted only a few minutes, and so I was really trying to hurry to capture this scene while there was light going on. So I went with darker exposures just to try to, not clip out the highlights too much and to try to hurry through this. I also shot it, you can see over here in the top right, I shot this at f/18. Again, that's because I was in such a hurry to try to get this done that I wanted to take as few files or as few exposures as I could, just so I could hurry through it and make sure I'm not missing the light. So at f/18, this allowed me to not have to have as many focus points throughout the scene because I get a little bit broader of a depth of field. It's not the sharpest aperture to be shooting at, in my opinion, but it was more just trying to hurry and get this done, if that makes sense. So the way I start is I always start here in the foreground. I set my foreground focus point, take a file, open it back up, set a focus point for a little bit further back, take a shot, open live view back up again, set the focus point for further back, take a shot, and then once I've got, kind of this background area in focus, then without changing a focus point, I take, a darker exposure, and that's just to blend in the sky. So what we need to do here is, this is pretty dark, so we need to open up the shadows quite a bit and get this to a workable level with exposure and opening up shadows. So I'll select all of these areas, or all the files I have for my land areas. I'm going to select all of these files here. And now I'm going to open up the shadows quite a bit. So the shadows, there's no real magic numbers here. I'm just kind of going by my eye and what I like to see as far as light levels in my photos. And your opinion might be a little bit different than mine. But that's starting to have enough detail in the shadows. I don't want a ton of detail in the darkest shadow areas. For me, it's important to leave shadows, pretty dark. I mean, you want detail in there, but you don't want them, to be completely opened up like this. It doesn't look natural. You start to lose some of the contrast between, light source and shadows. So something around here, that works pretty well for me. I also want to, make sure my exposure for my sky is looking good. It is pretty dark, so I'm going to open it up a little bit. But as I open it up, I'm going to be losing detail in some of my highlights. So, I'll open up the sky a little bit, but then I'll lower the highlights back down, just so I'm maintaining a good dynamic range in the sky. I can open up the shadows a little bit as well. And what that's going to do is make the blend between the highlights and the shadows a little bit easier to manage when we start doing our exposure blending. And that's something I'll get into here a little bit later. So just kind of dialing in your exposures is where I start. Something about like that tends to work for me. The next thing I like to do is dial in my white balance and my color. Just kind of getting all the colors as close to how I want them as possible. So I'm going to do that with all of these files selected. I want to make fairly global adjustments to everything here. If I'm adjusting the white balance in my land areas, I'll probably want to be adjusting the same white balance to my sky, so those areas kind of match. You don't want your sky to be a completely different, white balance and color of light than your land areas, because then it just doesn't look natural. There are occasions when, maybe you want to pump up the magenta in your sky a little bit more, just to bring out a little bit more color, and that's fine, but you don't want to go, strongly shifting white balance between sky and land areas, or it doesn't look like natural light. So in this one, I'm going to throw in quite a bit of magenta just to give it a little bit more color. It was coming across a little bit green. So for anybody who doesn't have a lot of practice or knowledge about white balance. White balance is pretty much is the balance of color in your image. So say you took something, straight out of camera and it was coming across as pretty green like that. The way you counter green is with magenta. So if things are looking a little bit too cyan or green, then you'll counter that. You'll remove some of that green by putting magenta in. Same thing with the temperature. If something is looking too cool, a little bit too blue, then you counter that with yellow by adding yellow into it. So you're warming it up. So in this one, I want things to be a little bit magenta, kind of twilighty. I don't want to go too warm with this. Something about like that. Maybe a touch more magenta. About there. I'm also going to dial in some saturation. And I do that with the vibrance and saturation sliders. The difference between these two sliders in the most simple terms is the vibrance slider targets colors that are less saturated. They don't already have a lot of saturation to them. So you can lean a little bit heavier on vibrance without having to worry about clipping colors. Saturation slider, that affects everything globally across the board. So whatever pixel it is, it's adding saturation to it. But the vibrance specifically targets lesser saturated areas. So I'm going to throw in a little bit of vibrance, and you'll notice vibrance always targets blues. For some reason, it reads blues as being low in saturation. So if you give it a good whack of vibrance, you'll notice your blues really start to come alive. So you don't want to go too crazy with it. The saturation slider, again, this affects everything globally across the board. So I'm just going to throw in a little bit of saturation here, not too much. The thing with vibrance and saturation in general in Camera Raw is I like to leave my image a little less saturated than how I want it to be when I'm done with it, in the end product. The reason for that is if I went and kind of maxed out the saturation to exactly where I wanted it right now, later on in Photoshop, when I go adding in contrast and in my last video, I did a lot with luminosity masks to kind of darken and enrich, kind of richen things up a little bit. When you do that, it starts to really add contrast to an image, or saturation to an image when you're adding contrast. So knowing that later on in Photoshop, I want to be adding a little bit more contrast through luminosity masks, I know that if I max out the saturation now, then it'll be oversaturated after that contrast work later on. And so I'm just going to leave it a little undersaturated at this point, just to avoid oversaturation later. It's always easier to go in later and add more saturation if I need it than it is to try to recover, oversaturated areas. So that's, about where I want my colors, kind of overall right now. But there are specific little things I want to change about the color in this shot. And for that, I use these HSL sliders over here, the hue, saturation, and luminance sliders. What I'm going to do with this, I only want to affect the land areas. I'm not wanting this to affect the sky at all. So I'm leaving my sky file unselected. So what these do in here, these HSL sliders, these allow you to adjust the hue, the saturation, and the luminance of any given color. So for example, these flowers here in the foreground, if I wanted these to be a little bit brighter, I could come in here to my blues, and it looks like there's a little purple in there as well, and I could raise the luminance of the blues and purples. That just makes them a little bit brighter. It helps them stand out a little bit more. If I wanted these flowers to be a little bit more maybe towards the purple and magenta scale, I could come into my blues and change my blues a little bit more towards purple, change my purples a little bit more towards magenta, and this helps them, just again, pop a little bit more, stand out a little bit more, and they're going to start to match the color of the light in the sky over here a little bit better. And that's something I like to do a lot, is have colors from the sky match some colors from the land. You can also change the saturation of them. If I wanted these flowers to be a little bit more saturated, I could add saturation to the blues and purples. I don't really think I need that in this file, so I'm going to undo that. But also my greens in here, and some of the foliage. I like to have foliage be slightly warm in color, not quite so green, just slightly a little bit more towards yellow. So under hue, I'm going to change the greens and the yellows, because a lot of the time what you perceive as green is actually yellow. We're going to take our greens and make them slightly more yellow, take our yellows and make them slightly more orange. And that's just going to tip them over just a little bit more warm. So something about there looks pretty good to me. Let's check out our sky file, make sure this is looking good. I think I need to recover a little bit more of the highlights in the sky. I'm losing a little bit of detail in this area here. So I'm going to do that in my tone curve panel. So with my highlight slider, I'll just darken that down until I feel about comfortable with it. I'm also going to add a little bit of clarity to this file. And I don't necessarily want the clarity adjustment, which is just, the clarity just kind of adds micro contrast. It's going to make things have a little bit more texture to them. I'd like to add some of that to the sky, but not quite so much to the mountain back here, because we are going to use a little bit of the mountain from this file. So I'm going to add a graduated filter. This allows you to just kind of feather things out. Right now it's set to darken the exposure a little bit, so I'll go 0 on that. I don't want to darken it any. In this clarity slider here, so this is at 0. So this is, this is unaffected. So when I add a little bit of clarity, you can see it just adds some micro contrast. It just makes things stand out a little bit more. And it's fading from this green dot where it's 100%, and then this red dot down here is 0%. So it just fades it through there. So if I wanted to have a little bit more of it, be at 100%, something like that, I just move the green one down. And so now it's 100% affecting up here, and it's fading it out from this green dot to the red dot. So let's look at that. That looks pretty good. We're adding quite a bit of the clarity to the sky, not quite as much here in the mountain, so it fades it out nicely. I might go for a little bit more saturation, just to try to get a little bit more color out of that band of clouds right there. Something about like that. But I don't want my blues to be quite this blue, so I'm going to back those down a little bit. And so I want to back down the color, but I don't want to do it globally to everything in the sky, because I don't want to lose any saturation in this kind of orange pink clouds we have there. So back in the HSL sliders, I can specifically desaturate the blues. So just pull those down just a little bit. And if I wanted to, I could add a little bit of saturation to the magentas and the reds and the oranges a little bit. And so that just kind of evens that out a little bit there. So that looks pretty good. We are going to have to fix this big dark spot from the polarizer. If you've done any landscape shooting with a wide angle lens and polarizer, you'll notice that the polarizer has trouble polarizing an entire sky on a wide angle shot like this. It did the majority of the middle of the sky here, but it didn't really polarize anything on this edge or on this edge. So we're going to have to even that out a little bit in Photoshop later on. The last thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to select all of these and check for noise, check for chromatic aberration. So let's zoom in here and see if we can find any nasty areas to fix. Again, this is on my old Canon 5D Mark II, so it doesn't handle noise as well as some of the modern cameras. You know, the Nikon's really doing great things with their sensors. I'm very impressed by my Sony A7R, which has the same sensor in it as the Nikon D800. It's really impressing me so far. But that's another point. So there's some noise in here to be fixed. You know, I'll just dial in just a little bit of luminance noise reduction. The luminance noise reduction is going to be the real pixelated type of noise that you see, you know, all the little spots of rough pixels. Color noise is going to be areas where, if you zoom in here, you can see it. There's little areas in here of kind of green and magenta little blotchy areas. That's what color noise is. You'll see it a lot in super dark shadows, especially in night shots. So if I see color noise, you know, I'll just dial in some color noise reduction until it's pretty much gone. I'm just going to max out the color noise slider here. I've never noticed any detrimental side effects from maxing out the color noise slider. It doesn't seem to harm colors. It doesn't make anything soft. You know, if you max out the luminance noise reduction, you know, that starts to really make things soft. So, you know, I'm pretty weary about doing that. But the color noise reduction, if I see color noise, I'm pretty comfortable with just maxing the slider out, making sure I get rid of all of it. So that looks like it's cleaned up quite a bit. You know, since I did add in some luminance noise reduction, I will add in a little bit of sharpening. So as far as sharpening goes, I don't like to do a lot of sharpening of my raw files. I'll do, you know, just a little bit here and there if I feel like it needs it. But mostly I prefer to save, you know, some of the real heavy sharpening for the end, you know, and not even for the end of my processing. You know, I'll process a file, you know, finish it and save it, having not sharpened it. The only time I ever really sharpen something is when I know what I'm going to be using it for, you know, the specific output. So say somebody orders a, you know, 40 by 60 print from me. I'll sharpen differently for a 40 by 60 print than I would, say, a 12 by 18 print. I also sharpen differently for a web JPEG than I would for a print. A lot of times, art directors at magazines will want something, you know, sharpened specifically for whatever output they're going to be using it for. Sometimes creative directors like to have their guys sharpen the photo for you. They don't want you to sharpen it because they know their print methods or whatever output they're going to end up using it for. So there's no real one sharpen, you know, there's no one sharpening that's going to work great for everything. So I sharpen specifically for an output. So for the most part, I don't sharpen my raw files that much. If I do a little bit of noise reduction like I did here, then I'll sharpen a little bit, just on the amount, and that's just to bring you know, the image back from any noise reduction that may have made it start to appear soft. But otherwise I don't get too into sharpening. I did notice there was some chromatic aberration around, and you'll find that on high contrast edges. Zoom in here. So you can see along this edge there's a little bit of a blue kind of halo, and that's chromatic aberration. In modern Photoshop, I think since Photoshop CS5, they've changed it to where it's just a one-click removal thing. It's over here in the lens corrections tab. You just click the remove chromatic aberration and it fixes it for you. The older versions of Photoshop, CS2, CS3, CS4, you couldn't there was no automated thing to do it for you. You had to adjust the sliders yourselves, and it was really kind of a pain in the butt and annoying. So that does pretty well at getting rid of chromatic aberration. It's always worked for me, just one click and it's gone. As far as lens profile corrections, I don't really get too into the profile corrections. What they mostly do is, it reads your EXIF data and loads in these presets based on your camera and your lens that you were using at the time, and it will try to fix any barrel distortion from your lens, and it'll also try to fix vignetting. When it comes to distortion and vignetting, if I'm running into something that I don't like, I prefer to fix it myself. If there's any distortion that I'm not really too fond of in the photo, I prefer to fix that myself with some warping. And if there's any vignetting, I normally don't mind it. I actually tend to accentuate some vignetting with dodging and burning. So that doesn't really bother me too much. So I normally don't enable the lens profile corrections. That's pretty much what would normally go into prepping my files in Camera Raw to be pieced together in Photoshop later on. So we'll go ahead and with all of these selected, we're going to open them and bring them into Photoshop. Okay, so we have these in Photoshop now, and what I did was I went through and stacked all of those different files on top of each other in a single file and have them all as layers now. You can see I've got them all here with my sky file here on the bottom. Force of habit for me is I always unlock my background layer. There's certain adjustments you can't do with the background layer locked. So unlocking that by just double clicking it, you can name it if you want to, I normally don't. Hit OK and it's unlocked. So now you can transform it, you can shift it, you can warp it. You can do certain things to it that normally you couldn't if that was locked. So I always just unlock my background layer first thing in Photoshop. Can turn these all back on. So now we need to get these files focus blended. What you'll notice here is when you're shooting these different focal points, when you actually change focus, your lens zooms in or out slightly. So you can see as I change focus point further and further back, it's zooming in slightly in each frame. So we need to take these and get them to line back up again. Very simple way to do that is you just select all your layers. So on a Mac, I'm going to hold Shift and click the bottom one. I've got the top one highlighted, hold Shift, click the bottom one, they're all selected. Now I'll go up to Edit and Auto Align Layers. You're just going to run this on the auto setting, hit OK. This will take a second. More than a second, but you know what I mean. Okay, so what it's done is Photoshop went and it read all the content on each layer and slightly stretched or maybe it shrunk things to try to get all of them to line back up again. So now you don't have that kind of zooming in or zooming out effect. You do lose a little bit on your edges, and that's normal. And that's something we'll fix a little bit later on. So now they all line back up so we can get them blended together well without having any weird overlapping issues. But now we need to actually get all the focus points blended together. You can do this by hand with just a simple layer mask. I don't prefer doing it that way. It's time consuming and tedious. Sometimes that's what you have to do. Especially in a lot of the big kind of perspective blends and vertical panorama stitches I've been doing lately. but we'll talk about that in another video because that one's in the works, and it's quite a bit more complicated than this is. But a simple focus blend like this, Photoshop can do most of the work for you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to forget about this bottom layer down here. This layer right here, this is just my sky. This isn't a different focus point. This is, the same focus point as this shot, the focus kind of for the midground and the background here. It's just a little bit darker. So that one doesn't have to do with anything with focus blending. So we're going to forget about that one right now. Okay, just turn that off. I'm going to select all 4 of these different focus points for the land areas, and I'm going to make duplicates of them to have as backups, and you'll see why in a couple minutes. So I'm going to take all of these and drag them down to the new layer icon down here in the bottom. I now have duplicates of these first 4 layers. I can turn these off for now. I don't need them. And that's another cool little trick. Whatever you're not using, if you keep the eyeballs turned off on them, it helps Photoshop run a little bit quicker. So I've got all 4 of these selected, my new duplicates, and I'm going to go to Edit, Auto Blend, and run this as stack images right here. We're not building a panorama, so just keep this stack images checked and keep this seamless tones and colors checked. Hit OK there. And so what's going to happen is Photoshop goes through and reads the sharpest bits of information from each file and builds all the masks for you. It does all the layer masking for you pretty much. And it does a pretty good job at this. It's not perfect. It's about as good as any focus blending software I've played around with. So let's go through and look at this now that it's done. So zoom in here. You can see the background's in focus. The mountain looks good and sharp. Midground is good and sharp. Foreground is pretty good and sharp. It did a pretty good job of piecing these together. There is some soft areas in here. This little, kind of twig piece of grass thing, that's soft, but I don't think that's soft due to the focus blending. I think that's just soft due to being blown in the wind. So I would just go ahead and clone that out. So let's look around here and see if there's any areas where Photoshop didn't do a good job of blending. It did pretty well here. Check back here. Yeah, everything looks pretty good, except for maybe these flowers right here, just a touch soft. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a merge visible layer. A merge visible layer simply takes everything that's visible right now, which would be, a combination of all 4 of these layers, and it copies it and stamps it all onto its own new fresh layer. So on a Mac, it's Shift Option Command E. On a PC, I believe it's Shift Control Alt E. And so now I can turn these off. And so remember, I had these 4 original files, the original layers. I made duplicates of them to use for the exposure blend, and I kept these as backups. So what I want to do now is I want to find one of these layers that has flowers that are sharp right in these areas. So I can turn these on and start looking through and trying to find one that's a little bit sharper than what our exposure blended one was, or our focus blended one, I'm sorry. So this one looks pretty good. It's got fairly sharp flowers, and the background behind them is not too soft. I'm looking for something that I can easily blend in to this top layer here, where the flowers are sharper, but I'm not going to be blending it in and having to worry about making the background soft either. So this one here, this layer 3, this works pretty well. So I'm going to take layer 3, put it underneath this layer 5 up here, which is our new merge visible layer. On that layer 5, I'm going to put a layer mask, and then just with a black soft edge brush at 100% opacity, I'm going to mask in a little bit sharper flowers over here. So I can mask this in, and I can go over the edge of these flowers a little bit and not worry too much because the background on this layer 3 is fairly sharp. I mean, it's soft, but it's not quite as soft as, you know, something like layer like layer 4 would be. That's pretty soft. So I'll just fix some of these areas. Hold shift and click on my layer mask and see that that's looking quite a bit better when I toggle that off and on. Not perfect, but you know, it's really hard to pull off a perfect focus blend in situations where maybe you have flowers that are slightly moving in the wind, or moving in the wind a lot is next to impossible to pull off a pretty perfect focus blend. So that fixed those areas a little bit. So I can go Shift, Option, Command E on a Mac. I'm going to make another merge visible layer. Again, in PC, it's Shift, Control, Alt, E. I can turn these back off now. And now this file all the way down here at the bottom, this was for my sky. Remember I told you to forget about this for a little while. Now we need to remember this file. So this one is properly exposed for the sky. You know, you don't have any blown out highlights or anything like that. So this one I'm going to take and put underneath of layer 6. I can turn layer 6 back on. And on that layer 6, I'm going to put a layer mask. And now we're going to blend in that darker sky. I do this just with a big soft edge brush. I don't get into doing a lot of my exposure blending with selections. It's a little tedious for me. It's, you know, it's not always perfect. So I prefer to do it by hand. Everybody's a little bit different. I know a lot of guys out there do all of their exposure blending with selections, and I just prefer not to. It's a personal preference thing. And again, if you've seen any of my other videos, you hear me talk about using my Wacom tablet. I use my tablet for everything. It's nice for me to be able to control the opacity of my brush with how hard I'm pushing on the actual tablet pad itself with my pen. I always recommend them. You can get them for pretty cheap. Brand new kind of low-end ones are like $80, and they're awesome and they work great. You don't need some fancy $300 one with buttons and wheels and levers and, you know, the whole circus that comes with it. You can get them for fairly cheap and they work great. So if you don't have one, look into getting one. It's a pretty good investment in processing as far as I'm concerned. I don't get paid by Wacom to say that, so don't think I'm trying to upsell you on something you don't need. So with just a black brush, I'm just going to come in here and just start to paint in this darker sky. So I'm going to come down here, get around the edges. Once I get down here towards the bottom, I'm pushing a lot lighter with my pen on my tablet, so it's actually not 100% opacity anymore. It's, you know, it's more like 50% because I'm pushing just, you know, ever so softly. Get that worked in there, and that looks pretty good to me. Let's zoom out here. Yeah, that gets the sky in there. It does a pretty good job. Everything looks fairly natural, except for I've gotten the tops of these trees significantly darker than the trees down here. That's a common problem with blends, with exposure blends. That's why a lot of guys use selections to do blends. So, you know, the selection selects everything, you know, in the sky, but nothing in the land. For me, I prefer to fix that problem a different way. I briefly touched on this with my first video, the painting with light video. I'll touch on it again here. To fix these areas where, you know, I've gotten the tops of the trees a little too dark, you know, compared to, you know, the rest of the trees down here, or even if I've gotten the top of the mountain a little bit too dark from blending in that dark sky. I fix that with dodging and burning through a selection. So I don't use selections to do all the masking for me, but I use selections to fix some of these areas. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a dodge burn layer. I have an action for it set up here. Right there, there's also an action for dodge burn layers in the Tony Kuiper luminosity masks. You can get this panel at goodlight.us. Tony Kuiper has tons of tutorials and actions you can buy. Sean Bagshaw has a really good video out about luminosity masks. Feel free to check all that stuff out. Well worth the investment. But if you don't have a dodge burn action, if you don't have the Tony Kuiper actions, I'll show you a quick, easy way to make one. You're just going to hold Alt on a PC or Option on a Mac and click the new layer icon. That brings up this little dialog box here. You're going to change the blend mode to soft light, and once that is done, you will notice this little checkbox down here, fill with soft light neutral color 50% gray. You're going to check that. You're going to hit OK. And that brings up this gray layer here. The layer is gray, but with the soft light blend mode, you can't see the gray. You can see it here on the edges because there's nothing there. But what the soft light blend mode does is it makes this 50% gray color that we have invisible. The only time you'll ever start to see it is if you change that gray to be a little bit more towards black, then it starts to darken things up. If you change that gray color to be a little bit more towards white, it starts to brighten things up. But when it sits right there at that 50%, that perfect medium gray, it won't show up. So if we wanted to, say, dodge out some of these dark areas, we could do that with a white brush on this gray layer. You know, with the white, we're starting to make things, brighter on this gray layer. So it's going to brighten things up in the image, for example, like that. Conversely, you use black, it's going to start darkening things up. So what I could do is I could come in here with, and you want to do this with a pretty low opacity on your brush, even if you are using a tablet or a Wacom tablet where you can control opacity with your pen tool. You still want to use a lower opacity for this. I could come in here with a white brush and start dodging out these trees. The problem is as I'm dodging out the trees, I'm also dodging out the sky that's around it. So we're fixing one problem but creating another problem. We're brightening up the trees, but we're also brightening up the sky, so that's going to look a little bit weird. It's going to create kind of some weird halos. So what we want to use is we want to use a selection, a luminosity selection. I won't get too into describing luminosity selections in depth, but what they pretty much do is they make selections based on brightness values of the image. I know we're going to want to make a selection of some of these darks, so I'm going to run all of my darks masks into the channels panel, come in here into the channels, and we can look at some of these selections that are available. So the way this view works is whatever is whitest is most selected. Whatever's darkest or blackest is the least selected. So in between there are all these shades of gray, which is kind of exponential, values of selection. This kind of lighter gray here is more selected than some of this darker gray over here. So you're no longer, working in that world of, kind of basic selections that Photoshop offers. Like if you just took your lasso tool and made a selection of something like that, whatever's inside of these, they call them the marching ants, these selection lines, whatever's inside is 100% selected. Whatever's outside is 0% selected. We're not working in an on or off type selection anymore with luminosity masks. It's all exponential. Things can be a certain percent of selected. So what we want to do is we want to find one of these luminosity selections that does a good job of selecting the trees, these dark trees here, but not selecting any of the sky behind it. So let's kind of scroll through these here. So this does a pretty good job. It does a better job than this one. This one, because the sky's darker, is selecting less of the sky. The trees are still fairly bright, so it's selecting quite a bit of the trees. But let's see if we can do this one. This one is doing quite a bit better. It's selecting a lot of the trees, and because back here in the sky it's black, none of that is selected. We start to get down into like the super darks here. It's not selecting quite as much of the trees. So I think this one does pretty well. Selects a good amount of the trees, none of the sky behind it. So that's what we want to use as a selection for when we're dodging those areas out. So let's take this, and the way to actually load this as a selection, right now it's just a channel. It's giving you a preview of what your selection will be, but it's not actually a selection yet. So to load it as a selection, I just take this, click on it, and drag and drop it onto this little circle down here. It looks like it's a circle made up of little dots. Drag and drop it onto there. Click on RGB so we can see our colors again. Come back over to our layers panel, and we have that selection loaded. Because we're no longer dealing with an on or off type selection, with this black and white, it's either selected or it's not. Since we're not working in that mindset anymore, you kind of have to ignore these selection lines. They don't really give an accurate representation anymore. So normally, if I've got a lot of these that pop up, I just hit Command H, and that hides those selection lines. That way, it's not gonna be shining in your face the whole time. You can actually see what you're doing. So my selection's still loaded. I just don't have to look at those annoying lines anymore. So now when I dodge, the only thing it's going to be affecting is those dark areas that are selected. It's not going to affect any of the sky behind it. So I can dodge these areas out, brighten them up, get them, back to the same brightness as some of the trees behind them. The same thing with the tops of the mountain here. Some of those started to get a little bit dark from that dark sky that we blended in. So we can brighten some of those up, kind of even these areas out. Some of these trees got a little dark. We can fix that. So let's turn that off and on here. You zoom in so you can see it a little bit better. So you'll see it fixed a lot of the areas that got dark from our blend. Very simple, very quick. If I wasn't sitting and talking your ear off the whole time while doing this, it would have literally taken 45 seconds to do it. So, real quick, easy way of exposure blending. This is the way I almost always exposure blend stuff. If we turn off these layers here, you can see just our dodge burn layer, and you can see that with that selection loaded, it only dodged out those darks that were selected. It didn't dodge out any of the sky behind it. Let's turn these back on. So that's a pretty simple way of going about it. Let's create another merge visible layer. But before that, we can't forget to deselect our selection. Because I turn off those selection lines, or the marching ants as people call them, sometimes it's easy to forget that you have a selection loaded. So you can't forget that you have a selection loaded, or whatever you do next is going to affect just those dark areas. So I'm just going to hit Command D, or you can go up to Select and hit Deselect. So now I don't have any selection. I'll create my merge visible layer, Shift Option Command E on a Mac, Shift Control Alt E on a PC. And now we've got those kind of wonky edges from when we did our auto align in the very beginning. Remember, we had to do that auto align to get things lined back up again because it's slightly zoomed in a little bit as we change focus points. You can use the crop tool for this. Just come in and crop out everything. All the wonky edges that you don't want in there. You can do that. I don't prefer doing it that way. A lot of the times, if you just kind of crop haphazardly to whatever you know to whatever the edges are, you'll lose your aspect ratio. And I like to stick to fairly standard aspect ratios, mostly for people who buy prints. If somebody orders a print and they pay good money to order a nice print, the last thing they want to do is have to spend even more money having a frame custom cut to fit your photo in it because you don't have this standard aspect ratio. I know for me, I've got some prints hanging up in my condo of friends' stuff or prints I've bought from people, and I don't like to go spend a ton of money having custom frames cut. I like to just be able to go out, purchase a nice frame. I want a nice frame, but I don't want to spend a ton of extra money having something custom made because my print just won't fit in there. So it saves time, it saves money. It just makes everything a little bit easier for the print buyer. So to avoid that, I don't use the crop tool too much. I just go to free transform, and which is Command T, or you can go up to edit free transform right there. And I just stretch these edges out until all the horrid edges are gone. I'll just pull that out, pull this one out, get rid of this top here, and get rid of the bottom. You can see down here in the bottom, there's some soft areas down here where things were shrunk and things didn't get focus blended. So we'll just pull that out until those are gone. There's something about there. That looks pretty good. Old versions of Photoshop may not have been able to do this very well. You might get a little bit of pixelation or it kind of damaged your image. Modern day Photoshop, CS6, CC, even CS5. I mean, the algorithms in Photoshop are so good that you can do this. You can just stretch your image out and not really worry about any damage to your photo at all. So we'll hit enter, load that. The last thing I'm going to show you guys on this photo here is just fixing a little bit of this, kind of poorly polarized sky. It did a good job of polarizing, but it didn't get the whole sky. These edges are significantly brighter. The way I fix that is just with some pretty simple dodging and burning. So again, to create a dodge burn layer, you can hold Option and click on the new layer icon. I believe that's Alt on a PC. Change your blend mode to soft light. Click this little checkbox, fill with soft light, 50% gray, hit OK. And then with the black brush, go to my brush tool here, fairly low opacity here. I want this to be worked in slowly. I don't want to go too crazy with it right off the bat. So big soft edge brush. This is the brush I'm using. We'll just start to burn this in. And this I just do by hand. Just try to get things even. You're just going to kind of eyeball it until it looks about right. And again, with my tablet, I'm able to control the opacity of my brush as I'm doing this. So as I get, closer in here, I might not need to push quite as hard. Keeps the opacity lower. So I've darkened in the edges quite a bit. I can also dodge out with a white brush some of the real dark center. So it doesn't have to be, I'm darkening this and darkening this. It can be, I'm darkening those sides, but also lightening the center a little bit. So let's zoom out and look at that. That looks pretty good to me. Very acceptable. So that's the way I'd go about fixing that polarizer issue. I have played around with what I called polarizer blends. My buddy Miles and I played around with this, and were intrigued at first, but I don't think it's worth it. It's where we had the polarizer turned, so it was affecting this spot. You take an exposure and then turn the polarizer a little bit more, so it's affecting this spot. Take an exposure, turn it again, so it's affecting here. Take an exposure, and so on. And then you blend all of those pieces together. It was a cool concept, I thought, but it works, but it's more of a pain in the ass than it's worth. So I prefer just doing it this way. So that's a pretty good intro to kind of how you put the puzzle pieces together on a shot like this. We did quite a bit of stuff. We auto-aligned, we auto-blended, then we put our sky in, we fixed some of the edges from the exposure blend, fixed the polarizer issue, and that's all the stuff that I kind of do right in the beginning that allows you to have a nice solid base image to start some of the more artistic stuff that you do to a photo that I kind of cover in some of my other files. You're just taking all those puzzle pieces together, building the puzzle, and then from the, once that puzzle's built, then you can go through and start some of the fun stuff, some of the, kind of painting light in there, or working the textures, working the contrast a little bit more. Yeah, so hopefully you guys got something out of this one, and let's move on to the next. Alright guys, so we've got another series of files here. It's going to be a pretty similar approach to the last file that we were working on here. Mountain wildflowers, very typical of my entire portfolio, unfortunately. I'm a little bit monotonous. This one will showcase actually a few problems with some of this stuff, how to fix those problems, a little bit more than we had to do in the last one, and some problems that I created by just not having the best practice in the field. Certain areas where I personally messed up, and I think it's important to focus on what you don't do very well. Mistakes you make that you really have to pay attention to those and learn from them. And so this is going to be kind of how I can help you guys learn from my mistakes. So what we have here is pretty straightforward shot. Again, this is another one where the light, not even so much the light, but the scene had to be captured really quick because of the elements or whatever. The last file, it was because the color in the sky was starting to fade pretty quick, and I really needed to hurry up and get the series of images taken. This one was because the mountain was only out from the fog for just a matter of a couple minutes. We had been sitting up here at this spot, waiting, hoping that the clouds would clear enough that the mountain would come out. And it did. A little bit later into the morning, the mountain finally came out of the clouds just for a moment. And so I had to try to, work as quickly as possible to get a series of shots before the clouds rolled back in and overtook the mountain. So again, these are shot at f20. There's a little bit of wind going on. So, I wanted a shorter shutter speed. So I shot this at ISO 1000 just to try to get a shorter shutter speed. At f20, I got a little bit more depth of field from each file, so I don't have to take quite as many focus points. And that was just because I was trying to hurry through this as fast as I could before the mountain hit in the clouds again. Normally, if conditions were perfect, I'd probably shoot this closer to like f11. I found on my 16 to 35 lens, the f11 is about the sharpest point on it. So normally I'd shoot this at f11 and just take more focus points. I would have taken one here and here and here and here and here and here and all the way back. I probably would have taken closer to like 7 or 8 different focus points. You know, this one I shot at f20. It's not the sharpest area on the lens, but it allows you to take less focus points because it has so much more depth of field. So just like before, let's look through these. You know, as my focus point changes, you can see that it's slightly zooming in a little bit. So what we have, this first file up here, this is focused for the immediate foreground. You know, kind of what the way I approach it is I set my focus point, but my first focus point for the foreground to whatever is closest to my lens. Where I messed up here personally was I got a little too close to these flowers, and I didn't notice it in the field. I didn't notice it until I got back home and, you know, tried to process these files, you know, a month later. You know, I was a little too close, and so, you know, my very first focus point, which was, you know, about as close as the lens could focus, couldn't quite focus on the very edge of these petals. They were just a little too close to my lens, to where my lens couldn't focus on them. There's, you know, a kind of a minimum focus distance on each lens. You know, like macro lenses are able to focus on things a lot closer than, you know, most wide angle lenses. So that's a mistake I made. You know, I just got too close. I wasn't paying attention. I was in too much of a hurry trying to capture this series of images while the mountain was out. And so my field technique kind of got pushed to the back burner as I was trying to hurry through this. So that's something to look out for as you're shooting these types of scenes, when you're doing your focus blending. It's really nice and cool to get, you know, right in on foreground flowers and foreground subjects. But sometimes you can get too close, and that was what happened here, and that was just my mistake. I should have caught it in the field, but I didn't. So, you know, hopefully by me showing you how I messed up, you've got a little bit of knowledge about what to look out for in the field as you practice this kind of stuff. Otherwise, I mean, I still consider it a very usable image. You know, I've printed this quite a few times for people, and you know, it looks all right. There's, you know, a little area where it's a little bit soft, but I don't think most people are that nitpicky about it. But it does still bother me as the artist when I mess areas like that up. Otherwise, you know, it's a pretty cool shot. I like it. I love the foreground arrangement. Probably one of the nicest foregrounds I've ever had the opportunity to shoot. But let's go through the same exact stuff as we went through in the last file. I mean, it's my raw approach. You know, converting my raw files is pretty much the same on every shot. Every shot's going to need something a little bit different, you know, and different adjustments, but, you know, it's kind of the same approach across the board. You know, these sky files here, or the land files, you know, all the files that I'm going to use for my land areas. I've got this one for the focus on the immediate foreground. This one focused a little bit further back in the foreground. This one's focused a little bit further back, kind of, you know, here in this mid-ground area. This one's focused on the background for the mountain. And then without changing focus points, just like in the last shot I showed you, without changing focus points, I took a darker exposure for the sky. It's a little bit too dark, but we'll fix that. So what I want to do with these is kind of just dial in the exposure to about how I want it. There's some dark shadows going on here in the foreground, a little bit too dark for my taste, so I'm going to open those up a little bit. But what happens as I open these up with the shadows and the blacks is the whole image starts to look quite a bit brighter. So I'm going to be darkening the exposure a little bit here. And so it's kind of a balancing act. You know, you can open up your shadows, but then if that starts to look too bright, then you can darken the exposure down. If that starts to look too dark, you brighten your shadows up a little bit more. So just kind of balancing that darkening and that, you know, shadow detail in there. This looks about right to me. You know, I tend to like slightly darker images as it is. this file here for the sky. This is a little dark for my taste, so I'm going to open this up a little bit. There's something about like that. I want it to be dark and moody, but I don't want it to be too underexposed looking. So something about there. Also, what I'm going to do to this sky file, kind of what I did to the last file we worked on, is I'm going to add quite a bit of clarity here into this sky. This is something I've been doing quite a bit lately, is trying to make skies pop a little bit more. And especially on a shot like this, the sky, it's got some nice clouds and fog in it, but it's a little flat looking. So really going to bump the clarity up in it, and so that just gives it a little bit extra drama, a little bit extra contrast. I could darken it down slightly if I wanted to, maybe there, and it's really only going to affect the top areas because it's fading out from this green to the red dot. Up towards the top it's 100%, and then it just slowly fades out from there. Something about like that. And then I'm going to select all of these and make a white balance adjustment. This was later in the morning. The color had started to die a little bit. It wasn't quite as colorful as early morning would be. So I'm going to warm this up a little bit, try to bring out as much color in that sky as we can. You don't want to go overboard with it. It's tempting to try to really max out saturation and white balance adjustments to make it look like some really awesome sunrise or sunset. It's tempting to do that, but you've got to have a little bit of willpower not to do it, because a lot of the times it just looks like you took something bland and just overcooked it, trying to make something out of nothing. I used to be guilty of that a lot, and I still am guilty of it every now and then. So don't go overboard. If there's not a lot of color there, just kind of embrace it. Not everything, in my opinion, has to be some fiery sunset or sunrise. Just some nice warm golden light is nice too. The light should be, the sky should be secondary to the subject. A lot of people make the sky the subject in their shots, and that's fine from time to time, but as a landscape shooter, the landscape is the subject, and that should be the beauty. The sky should be secondary and just kind of complement the scene, not be the subject as a whole. But we are going to try to squeeze a little bit more kind of warm color out of this. So added in some magenta. I warmed it up quite a bit. You don't want to warm it up so much that the blues in your sky aren't blue anymore. You still want those areas to be blue, or else it's just going to look really fake. So something about there, that looks pretty good for the sky. Let's see what those adjustments did for the land areas. For me, the land areas are a little bit too warm now, and so I'm slightly going to cool this down. And I know I talked in the beginning of the video on the other image we were working on that it's good to kind of have the colors from the sky in the light match what's happening in the landscape, but I want to go a little bit cooler on this here in the foreground. So I'm just going to cool this down, not a whole lot, just enough to where the foreground's going to be cool, but the background's going to be nice and warm. That's going to create a really good transition from front to back. The eye naturally likes to travel from kind of darker, cool areas into brighter, warmer areas. And so that's going to give you, a nice transition through the shot. So something about like that, not overdoing it to where the sky, this warm sky, is going to look out of place with the cool foreground. But just, a slight variance there. Another thing I'm seeing here is, I could use a little bit more pop in the color, kind of overall. Let's add some saturation and vibrance to the land areas first. I'll just kind of dial that in a little bit. Again, I'm going to keep this a little bit less saturated than how I want my end product to be, because when you go and start adding a lot of contrast with luminosity masks and things like that, this stuff I talk about in my texture and mood video, that's going to start to add quite a bit of saturation. So I'm going to leave this a little less saturated, knowing that, you know, later on down the road, all the contrast work is going to, you know, really boost up the colors. That way I'm not ended up with clipped out areas. So that looks pretty good to me. Let's look at the sky area. This could use, you know, a little bit of saturation, you know, just pulling more color out of it. You know, as I'm looking at it, it does look still pretty dark. I'm going to open this up just a little bit. About there. You know, I want this area to be bright, but maybe I can throw in another graduated filter onto this where I'm just darkening up just that top of the sky area. I don't need a whole lot of clarity in this because I've already added quite a bit in. I'm just going to darken it a little bit. That looks pretty good to me. Back here on our land files, you know, all the files we're going to use for our land areas, all the magenta I threw into the white balance, you know, it looks pretty good everywhere except for these flowers here in the foreground. If you're not familiar with these asters, they're not normally very pink. They're more of a bluish or a slight lavender color. But all that magenta I threw in really started to make them pink. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back here into the HSL sliders that I showed you guys before. Go into my hue, and these probably register as a purple. I'm going to change the purples to slightly more blue, and I'm going to change the magentas slightly more towards purple. The blues I can make a little bit more blue, there we go. So that does pretty good. It takes out a lot of that pink. It makes them a little bit more natural colored. Yeah, something about like that. If I wanted to make these pop a little bit more, I could do that. You know, with luminance, I could come in here and open up the purples quite a bit. And even if I wanted to make the center of these flowers to stand out more, I could open up the oranges a little bit, you know, raise the luminance on the oranges. So that looks quite a bit better to me. It's a little bit more natural of a color, a little bit brighter so they stand out more. You know, I'm going to select all my files now and go through and check for things like noise. I shot this at ISO 1000 on my old 5D Mark II. So there will be some noise. You know, it's significant, but it's manageable. So under luminance noise reduction, I'll add enough in there until it starts to get rid of the noise, until I start to not notice it as much. Looks pretty good there. It is getting a little bit soft from the noise reduction, so I'll toggle in a little bit of sharpening. And now some of the noise is coming back. So it's just kind of a balancing act between getting things sharp but having very little noise in them. So that looks pretty good there. I did notice some chromatic aberration in some of the high contrast edges. Let's try to get rid of some of that. For example, right in here on some of the edges of these flowers, you can see a little bit of blue aberration in there. So under Lens Corrections and Color tab, I will click this Remove Chromatic Aberration. And that got rid of most of it, not all of it. But I think it's very manageable. You know, not too much of a concern in those areas. That looks pretty good. So now we'll go ahead and open these files up. Okay, so we've got all of these files opened up into Photoshop here in separate tabs. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through and stack all these on top of each other as layers. I think I skipped over that part in the first file we worked on. So if you don't know how to do that, super simple. I'll show you real quick. This one, I'll start stacking everything on this file here. So I'm just going to go through and hit select all and then copy and then paste it over here. I'm going to do that with all of these files. Unfortunately, you can't have these opened up already stacked when working in Camera Raw. I know in Lightroom and in Bridge there's an option to open all of these already stacked on top of each other, but Adobe Camera Raw doesn't have that option, so you just do it yourself real quick, or you use Lightroom. Lightroom is just as good as Camera Raw in my opinion. I just never got around to using it. It's more due to my laziness than anything else. So now that everything's stacked, I can go ahead and close all these files. I've got everything over here stacked on top of each other as layers. Again, I always unlock the background layer. I just double click and hit enter. That allows you to do things like auto align and any transforming or warping that you might need to do on this layer. Always just unlock that, force a habit. So just like before, we need to go through and auto align these. So we'll do that again real quick. So I'm going to select all of these layers, hold shift and click. That selects all of them. Then I'll go to edit, auto align layers, run this on auto, hit OK. Hopefully your guys' computer's faster than mine. If you're a drummer, you could give me a drum roll. There we go. And now we need to do our focus blending, just like before. Just like in the first file we worked on, we have our dark file for the sky. This file is not going to be focus blended. That's for the exposure blend. So forget about that one for now, because that's not for the focus blend. These top four, these are for the focus blend. So I'm going to select all of these layers, these 4 layers, and I'm going to drag and drop them down here on the new layer icon. That way I have backups of those layers to use for fixing any areas where Photoshop didn't blend them quite right. So I can turn those off for now. And I will go to Edit, Auto Blend, and run this on stack images with the Seamless Tones and Colors checked. Feel free to take a sip of your beverage of choice. Mine is water. Practice patience. And there we go. Excuse me. So, looking through here, let's double check and make sure Photoshop did a good job. It didn't do great back here in the mountains. There's some soft areas back here in the mountain, but otherwise things are looking all right. There's a soft little patch right in there that we'll have to fix. There's some ghosting of flowers here. So what happened here was from one exposure to another, the wind had slightly moved the flowers. So when Photoshop went to blend them together, they were in different places. So Photoshop's not able to, pick and choose exactly, which piece is perfect. So we're gonna have to fix that area. There's some of it going on in this flower as well. There's quite a bit of the ghosting going on here in this flower. And there's a few kind of botched areas in this flower. So this one's going to be a little bit more work than the last one. There's some areas there. So what we're going to do is we're going to, for starters, create a merge visible layer. Again, on a Mac, it's Shift Option Command E. On a PC, it's Shift Control Alt E, I believe. I can turn these off. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to look for my original files down here. But I made backups of these. I'm going to look for the originals down here that I can use to blend in to the areas that got messed up. So let's look and see here. I think this file right here, this layer 4, that looks pretty good. It doesn't have any of the messed up areas in the flowers over here, like we have in our focus blended one. Some of these areas got a little botched. So we're going to use this to fix some of those areas. So I'm going to take layer 4, put it underneath this layer 5. I will create a layer mask on layer 5. And with a black brush, I'm going to fix some of these botched areas here, just so things are sharp again. A little piece right there. And so this is still a little soft in through here, but again, that was my own doing. That was because that flower was too close to my lens to where it couldn't get in focus. Let's see. We can fix some of this flower here. Just get rid of some of that ghosting. Let's see. So I think if we move back to some of these flowers that are more kind of in the, it's not quite the midground, but it's further back in the background, we're going to need a different layer. So I'm going to create another merge visible layer. I can turn these off, and then let's find one that works for these flowers back here. So this one looks pretty good. Let's see, compared. I actually think this layer 2 is going to work better. The reason being, let's put this up underneath layer 6. The reason being, I mean, we're looking for one of the originals where, these flowers are sharp, but also that the background's still a little bit sharp back behind it. We don't want to go with one where the background's starting to get pretty soft behind the flowers, because then as we blend in some of the fixed areas in here, we're also going to be blending in a little bit of soft foliage behind it. We're not going for that. So you kind of want to find a happy medium between, something that's pretty sharp in the flowers, but also pretty sharp behind the flowers. So I think we found it in layer 2. I'll put a layer mask. A layer mask on top of layer 6. And again, we'll just kind of blend this in and fix some of this ghosting that we've got going on. And this is just kind of one of the natural downfalls of working with a subject like foreground flowers that are so prone to blowing in wind. I mean, flowers are so light. If there's the smallest breath of wind, they want to move. So focus blending areas like this can get a little tedious with flowers moving so much from one frame to another. So that looks pretty good there. It's not perfect. This little petal right here is a little bit soft, but for me it's perfectly acceptable. I'm okay with allowing a few areas not to be absolutely 100% perfect in my shots. I'm not at all a perfectionist in my work. I go for an overall good image. I'm not looking for every teeny tiny little bit of depth of field and dynamic range. I'd like to extend depth of field and dynamic range, but it's not always going to turn out perfectly, and that's fine with me. So we fixed that. That looks pretty good. Let's create another merge visible layer. Turn those off, and now we can fix some of the soft areas that were back here in our background. And we're going to use layer 1 for this. this layer is focused all the way back here in the mountain. So I'm going to take this, put that underneath layer 7, can turn layer 7 back on, put a layer mask on it, and then again with a black brush I'm just going to paint in some of layer 1 where Photoshop didn't quite do a great job of focus blending back there. So it was a little soft in the mountain. There's some soft areas in through here that I'll paint in. This little edge there. I'm just trying to look close at any areas that might be not quite in focus. So that looks pretty good to me. Yep, I'm happy with that. So again, I can create another merge visible layer now. Hopefully by now you're used to creating those and you don't even have to look at the keyboard to do it anymore. I know I don't. Now we're going to take our dark exposure for the sky. This one, we're going to put that underneath our new merge visible layer. Put a layer mask on the merge visible layer, that layer 8, and now we can just paint in our dark sky. This one's going to be a little bit easier of a blend than the last one because there are no real hard edges. That fog kind of softens everything up. So, you know, if we go over a little bit, that's fine. We can kind of feather it out. We don't have to worry too much about it. So something about like that. So that gets that dark sky in there. It gives us our nice mood. We don't really have to worry about, you know, fixing any edges like we did in the last one when we made those trees too dark and had to brighten them back up with that selection and dodging and burning. We don't have to worry about that too much in this because there are no real hard edges. Everything kind of blends seamlessly when you use a large enough brush and just kind of feather it out slightly. So that looks pretty good to me. I'll create a merge visible layer. And again, I'm going to just go to free transform to fix the edges on this. You know, it's Command T, or you can go up to edit free transform, or I think it's Control T on a PC. And I'm just going to pull these edges out. Again, you know, with modern day Photoshop, you don't have to worry too much about this damaging your image at all. I've never noticed it do anything detrimental to my files if I'm just doing such a small amount like this. And again, this is going to keep your aspect ratio in check. Keeps it pretty standard. Another little tidbit I'm going to throw in for you guys here, and I'll cover, you know, this a lot more in a video at a later date. But I'm going to warp this slightly just to kind of fix some of the perspective in the shot. So I'll hit enter there on my free transform, and I'm going to go into edit transform warp. So what I'm going to do here is just kind of fix things a touch, and you know, feel free to play around with this and practice this and get yourself familiar with it. But what my thinking is here is there's a lot of just kind of open dead space down here in this immediate foreground, kind of below these flowers. That's not really doing a whole lot. You know, I'd like to have the flowers a little bit lower to kind of start the scene off with flowers and not with just kind of some of this gravel that's down here and just kind of boring leaves. So I'm going to pull these flowers down just a little bit. Something about like that. And just kind of fill that foreground in a little bit. What you're going to notice now though is everything's starting to kind of get this bowed shape to it. And you don't want that, you know, especially back here in the background. So I'm going to pull this area up, you know, click up here where it's starting to bow. I'm okay with it bowing down here, but not up here. So whatever I'm wanting to work on that's the area that I'm going to click. You know, click and drag. So, I click and drag this down because that's the area I wanted stretched. I wanted to stretch this area back up, so I clicked and dragged in that area. I also think I'd like a little bit more room up above my mountain here. It's a little high in the frame for my taste, and that's personal preference. I mean, it's almost right on kind of a third where the horizon is, but I might want a little bit more room up top. So I'm going to take this side and stretch this down. I'll take this side and stretch this down. And then I'm also going to take the middle and stretch that down. You'll notice I'm starting to lose some of my top, so I can just pull this up a little bit. About like that. That looks a little bit better to me. And another thing I've been known to do, and sometimes I do this, too much, to where it starts to look wonky. I've been trying to teach myself to be a little bit more controlled with it. But I like to squeeze mountains together from side to side a little bit. What it does is it makes them look just a little bit taller. Some mountains, especially this mountain here, Mount Rainier, from this angle, Mount Rainier doesn't look very tall and aggressive, especially when you're looking at it through a wide-angle lens. I mean, wide-angle lens just has a way of making things that appear dominating and overpowering to the eye appear like, tiny little speed bumps, way back in the distance. So I just kind of squeezed it together slightly, and that gives it the illusion that it's a little bit taller, without actually having to stretch it and make it taller. If I tried to stretch it to make it taller, I'd lose more of my sky. And I just did the work to try to get a little bit more sky in there. So I found just squeezing it together slightly can give it a little bit of a taller look. Let's hit enter and look at that. Okay, so the before and after, it fills that foreground in quite a bit better. The mountain appears a little bit taller. Something's going on with my computer. There we go. So undo. That's before. That's after. For me, my personal preferences, I like this a little bit better. If you go overboard with it, it can start to make it look like an unrecognizable mountain. So you don't want to go too crazy with it. But I feel okay with putting a little bit of my own spin on something. I don't claim to be a journalist. I barely claim to be an artist. But that's something that would work for me. Otherwise, I mean, this is pretty much the way I start my photos is, getting all this technical stuff done, piecing that puzzle together. You've got to get all the technical stuff out of the way before you start, all the fun artistic stuff. And for me, this part of processing, this isn't the fun part. This is just kind of, getting a good starting point. Doing your raw conversion, doing your focus blending, doing your exposure blending. To me, that stuff's not enjoyable, but it has to be done before you can go, dodging and burning and playing with textures and playing with the light and getting the mood that you want. So this stuff is just as important, not quite as fun for me. Maybe you're different. Maybe you kind of like some of this technical stuff. But this is stuff that has to be done. So hopefully this gives you a little insight as to my approach, at least. I mean, this might not be everybody's approach, but this is how I do it. This is what works for me. So hopefully you learned quite a bit. We covered a lot of stuff. And yeah, if, like I always say in the end of my videos, if you guys have any questions, I mean, don't hesitate to send me a Facebook message, send me an email, come knock on my door and yell at me or something. Tell me I didn't explain things good enough. Just let me know. I'm always around to help. That's the whole reason I do this is, trying to help other people. So, yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed. Take it easy. Bye-bye.